The moment I pulled into the gravel driveway of my new mountain cabin, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in years. The trees stood tall and quiet, the breeze was crisp, and the only sound was the distant call of a bird somewhere in the woods. I had just escaped the chaos of city life and traded it for the quiet hum of nature. I was ready to start fresh. No neighbors peeking over fences, no traffic, no noise. Just me, my cabin, and the peace I'd longed for. I hadn't even finished unloading the last box from the back of my truck when I saw them, 3 people briskly walking up the path toward my front porch like they owned the place. Matching clipboards, stiff expressions, polo shirts tucked into khakis. If there was ever a stereotype of an HOA board, this was it. I thought maybe they were lost or just saying hello. Small-town kindness, right? Wrong. The woman in the lead didn't bother introducing herself. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You can't build here without HOA approval. This cabin violates community codes." Just like that. No welcome, no questions, just a threat. The man behind her flipped through a packet of printed documents like he was auditioning for a courtroom drama. The third person, a younger guy, hung back but nodded in agreement as if he was just there to observe and approve their antics. I was stunned. I'd been here less than an hour. I hadn't even unpacked my coffee maker. And now I was being accused of breaking rules I'd never heard of, by people I'd never met, about land I had just legally purchased with full documentation. I asked them what they were talking about, and that's when they began rattling off a series of supposed violations: unauthorized structure, improper fencing, restricted roofing material. Even my porch lights were apparently non-compliant. It sounded ridiculous. They hadn't even stepped foot inside the house. I asked if they'd like to see the paperwork from the sale, the permit history, or even just my ID to show I had just moved in. But they weren't interested in facts. They were interested in control. What really got me was their tone. It wasn't concern or formality. It was entitlement. As if I had personally offended their sense of order by existing in their neatly managed bubble. I could feel the adrenaline starting to creep up my spine, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. I had dealt with difficult people before, but this was a whole new level of audacity. They handed me a folded notice demanding I attend a compliance meeting within the week. No signature, no contact info, just a time and a location at the HOA clubhouse. Then they turned around and walked off without another word, like they'd just delivered divine judgment. I stood there on the porch, holding their letter, watching them disappear down the path they barged in on. I spent the rest of that day trying to enjoy my new home, but the uninvited HOA visit kept replaying in my mind. Their accusations echoed louder than the wind in the pines. I hadn't even gotten the chance to settle in, and already I was being told that I wasn't allowed to live peacefully on property I had legally purchased. Still, I told myself maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they had outdated information or hadn't realized the land had changed hands. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. That was my first mistake. The very next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It had big block letters that read, "Immediate violation, action required." Beneath that was a long list of supposed infractions: unregistered structure, violation of HOA architectural guidelines, improper driveway material, non-approved exterior color scheme, and something about non-compliant landscaping, which was laughable because I hadn't even mowed yet. There was even a complaint about the chimney design, stating it didn't match the aesthetic of the community. I stared at the paper, trying to understand how my simple wooden cabin, tucked quietly into the hillside, could possibly be causing such a stir. That same afternoon, another member of the HOA, someone I hadn't seen the day before, showed up unannounced. He introduced himself as the Architectural Compliance Chair. whatever that meant, and started taking pictures of my property without asking. I stepped outside to ask him what exactly the issue was, and he launched into a speech about how I had bypassed all necessary approvals, that I was in violation of multiple codes, and that the HOA board would be forced to take further steps if I didn't act immediately. I asked him to show me the actual rules, something in writing that explained their accusations. He said the guidelines were internal documents and not available to non-members. That raised a red flag. I told him I wasn't part of the HOA. His eyes narrowed, and he simply said, "If you live on this land, you're part of the HOA." That made no sense. I had reviewed the sale documents carefully. Nowhere had it mentioned an HOA. In fact, I had specifically chosen this cabin because it was outside of any such community restrictions. But these people were acting as if they had full authority over me and my property. They kept referring to covenants and jurisdiction, like they were quoting scripture. It wasn't a conversation, it was a declaration. They believed I was guilty of some offense simply because they said so. Later that day, I found another envelope wedged under my windshield wiper. Inside was a typed letter threatening daily fines if I didn't submit an application for compliance within 5 business days. The letter warned of escalating penalties and legal consequences should I fail to respond. There was still no explanation for who gave them this authority, or why they believed they had jurisdiction over my land. By the 3rd day, I knew something didn't add up. I wasn't just dealing with nosy neighbors. I was dealing with people who believed they had legal power over land they didn't seem to understand. So, I decided to dig deeper. I pulled out my purchase documents, the property deed, and every single scrap of paperwork I'd signed when I bought the cabin. I wanted to be sure there were no hidden HOA clauses, no fine print I might have missed. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. There was nothing tying my land to any homeowners association. No signatures, no declarations, no encumbrances. Just clean ownership. I even checked the zoning codes for the area. My cabin sat on unrestricted land, well outside the boundaries of any planned community. Still, something didn't sit right. Why were they so confident? Where were they getting their claims from? I decided to visit the county records office. It was a bit of a drive into town, but I needed answers from an official source. I walked in with a folder full of documents and told the clerk what was happening. She was kind enough to help me pull the plat maps, tax records, and historical land divisions. What we found stunned me. Apparently, my land was once part of a large estate that had been subdivided decades ago. A portion of that land had eventually become part of a gated HOA development nearby, but not all of it. My parcel had remained separate, privately owned, and was never formally annexed into the HOA. The property lines on the map were clear. My cabin sat completely outside their boundary. It was like living near a gated neighborhood, but not in it. Yet, for some reason, the HOA had been behaving as if my land belonged to them. That discovery led me to request copies of the HOA's own charter and boundary declarations. The county clerk said those were public records too, though rarely requested. When we found them, it confirmed everything. The HOA's own official documents made no mention of my parcel, or any obligation for me to comply with their rules. They had no legal claim, no jurisdiction, and no authority over my land. I remember standing there in the records office, staring at the map and shaking my head. How many other people had just accepted HOA pressure without questioning it? How many homeowners had been tricked into thinking they were subject to rules that didn't even apply? It was infuriating to think how far these people were willing to go to assert power they didn't have. With this new information, I returned home more determined than ever. I printed out everything: the maps, the deed, the HOA's boundaries, and organized it all in a binder. I wanted to be prepared the next time they showed up. If they were going to accuse me of violating their rules, I'd be ready to prove just how wrong they were, with evidence in hand. 2 days later they came back, same bold knock, same arrogant posture, same air of manufactured authority. This time, there were 4 of them. The original 3 were there, joined by an older man who introduced himself as the HOA president. He was wearing a blazer despite the summer heat and carried a leather folder like he expected to sign something official. He didn't even wait for pleasantries. He launched right into it, saying my failure to respond to the violations notice and refusal to attend their meeting had triggered the next phase of enforcement. His words were calm, but they were laced with threat. I calmly invited them to the porch and brought out the binder I had prepared. I opened it to the page that clearly showed the county plat map and my parcel outlined in bold. I walked them through the legal description, showing them the boundary lines and the document trail that led directly to me as the sole owner. I showed them the zoning classification, the exclusion from HOA jurisdiction, and copies of the HOA's own charter documents that explicitly defined the limits of their control, limits that stopped well before reaching my property line. The moment I began speaking in legal terms and referencing county records, their expressions began to change. The woman who had first accused me of violating the HOA's aesthetic code shifted uncomfortably. The man who had been flipping through documents earlier went silent. The president tried to maintain composure, asking where I had gotten those files, and whether I had spoken to a lawyer. I told him everything came from the county clerk's office, public records, and that I had every right to live on my land without interference. He leaned in and tried one last tactic, claiming that even if my property wasn't officially part of the HOA, it was within the community footprint, and therefore subject to shared standards. That was the moment I pulled out the page that made all the difference, the deed showing I not only owned my cabin, but also a narrow strip of land that connected the surrounding HOA community to the main road. That strip had been overlooked for years, passed along during land sales, eventually ending up in the parcel I bought. Without realizing it, I had become the owner of the very access point their entire community relied on. The silence was instant. The president's confident stance wavered. I could see the gears turning in their heads as they began to realize what this meant. They hadn't just messed with a non-member, they had picked a fight with the person who legally owned the land their private road crossed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply pointed to the records and stated that from what I could tell, I was under no obligation to their HOA, and in fact, it might be the other way around. One of them muttered something about having to consult legal, and they gathered their folders and left without another word. The next few days were unusually quiet. No knocks on the door, no threatening letters, no strangers photographing my property from the bushes. It felt like the calm after a storm, but I knew better. When people like that go quiet, it usually means they're regrouping. Sure enough, on the following Monday, I received a certified letter, official HOA letterhead, thick envelope, and filled with legal jargon that sounded intimidating at first glance. They were now claiming I was interfering with established community access, accusing me of obstructing the private road that connected their neighborhood to the main highway. It was a desperate pivot, one meant to put me on the defensive, but they had no idea that I had already anticipated this move. The truth was, I had done nothing to block access. The road was still fully usable, and I had no intention of restricting it, not yet anyway. But their letter made it clear they were now trying to pressure me from another angle, likely in hopes I'd back down and agree to their so-called compliance resolution. They even offered to waive all prior violations if I agreed to a permanent easement and signed a modified community agreement that would place my land under HOA authority. That part made me laugh out loud. They weren't trying to resolve anything, they were trying to flip the script in their favor. I decided to respond, not with a lawyer, not with anger, but with documentation. I drafted a detailed reply, attaching every relevant page from the county records, including my deed, the easement history, which showed no formal agreements ever existed, and a legal opinion I'd received from a real estate consultant who confirmed I had every right to deny or allow access as I saw fit. I sent the packet by certified mail and copied their board, their legal contact, and even the county zoning office, just for transparency. That response must have hit a nerve, because 2 days later, I received a request for a private meeting to clarify any misunderstandings and explore a cooperative solution. It wasn't an apology, it was damage control. When we met, it wasn't at my place or theirs, but in a neutral space, a quiet conference room at the town library. The tone was noticeably different. No accusations, no ultimatums, just polite smiles and a lot of careful wording. The president tried to steer the conversation toward mutual benefit, suggesting that maybe I'd consider a formal agreement to grant the HOA continued use of the access road. I listened. I nodded. Then I reminded them of everything they had done before this point: the unannounced visits, the threats, the false violations, the harassment. I pulled out copies of every notice, every photo they took without permission, and the binder with their failed claims. The room grew tense. One board member had the decency to look embarrassed. Another tried to deflect, saying they were just following protocol. But the damage had been done. They had approached me like a problem to be managed, not a neighbor to be respected. And now, sitting across from me, they realized they had no leverage left. After that meeting at the library, things shifted dramatically. The HOA's once aggressive stance had softened to what almost felt like nervous politeness. I wasn't naive enough to believe it was genuine. They weren't being kind, they were being careful. They'd figured out just how badly they'd miscalculated, and now they were scrambling to limit the fallout. But I had no intention of letting them off the hook that easily. They'd tried to intimidate me, lied about their authority, and attempted to coerce me into surrendering control of my own property. That wasn't something I could overlook. So I decided it was time to make sure they never tried it again, against me or anyone else. I started by consulting with a local attorney who specialized in land use and property rights. I laid out everything: the deed, the access road, the attempted overreach, the pattern of harassment. He confirmed that not only did I have full rights to deny the HOA access to the road, but I could also demand back compensation if I chose to charge for ongoing use. That opened up options I hadn't even considered. While I wasn't interested in squeezing money from my neighbors, I was interested in setting boundaries. The lawyer helped me draft a formal notice of land use terms, outlining the conditions under which the HOA and its residents could continue using the road that passed through my property. It was professional, reasonable, and fully enforceable. I wasn't blocking access, I was protecting it on my terms. The notice made it clear that if they violated those terms, access could be revoked with written notice. That alone was enough to make sure I'd never see another clipboard-wielding board member on my porch again. But I didn't stop there. I attended the next public town council meeting, not to file a complaint but to make a record. I stood up, calmly and clearly explained what had happened, and submitted a written summary of my experience. I detailed how an overreaching HOA board had attempted to bully a private landowner into compliance using fabricated violations and intimidation tactics. I didn't name names, but everyone in that room knew exactly which HOA I was referring to. The purpose wasn't revenge, it was transparency. I wanted it on record that this had happened, so others could come forward if they'd experienced something similar. The impact was immediate. Within a week, I started hearing whispers from neighbors, some from within the HOA itself, thanking me quietly, saying they'd always felt the board had too much unchecked power. A few even mentioned past incidents that had never been challenged because people didn't know they had a choice. I had unintentionally become a symbol of resistance to overreach, simply by refusing to be pushed around. The final move I made was filing a formal complaint with the county planning office, not to punish the HOA, but to prompt an audit of their governance practices and ensure they weren't making false claims about their authority to future property owners. That investigation would take time, but the process had begun, and the power dynamic had clearly shifted.